Hello everybody, welcome back to more Art of War, Hell Hath No Fury. I apologise, it's been a few days since I've done this at all. I had really low energy for some reason. I was really tired and just didn't have the energy to do much following the weekend. It was very strange. But I got a really good night's sleep last night and I'm feeling better. I'm ready to plough forward. We are up to chapter 12. When we left off, Amanda was still trying to get hold of her sister and was worried about what had happened. Joe managed to get hold of Parker, who filled him in on everything that had gone on. You know, that they'd been to the house of the witch that sold William for the magic. She was still, well, not alive, but her spirit was there and very territorial and attacked Martha and Olivia, and Parker got hurt in the process. And when they went to get him some help, they encountered somebody else, which was scary and intimidating. But everybody seems to be fine, and Martha is off somewhere debriefing her Nephilim friend. So as we jump back into chapter 12, that is where the story picks up. So I'm going to jump right into it. Haven't done this for a while, so it might be a little bit rough. I apologise. Okay, chapter 12. The occupying force of Nephilim warriors led by Stefan North had set up base camp in a forgotten area of the Blackthorn Hills, a nook concealed deep within dense woodland on the banks of a dried-up riverbed. The dishevelled path of overgrown weeds and jagged rocks was flanked on both sides by an impressive contingent of corrugated steel huts that the warriors had erected to use as simple barracks for storage of arms and supplies. A stone bridge arched up over the riverbed in the middle of the camp, a focal point that the base had sprung up around from. Its greying stone blocks had been battered by the elements, but it stood firm, an inspirational monument to the stalwart soldiers who'd been engaging in what had been a fraught, violent standoff within the area, a battle of attrition against many odds. The perimeter of the camp was a dense wall of overgrown trees, providing a natural barrier, fauna standing in perfectly regimented formation against the forces of darkness. But Martha could sense the concealment and barrier spells that bolstered its guard, hiding it away from potential discovery. She followed Stefan down a path that led over the bridge, a cobbled and uneven throwback to a time when it might well have guided travellers from one small hamlet to another, before it was forgotten to time, lost to the encroaching wilderness. Being inside of the camp felt good, not simply because of what had happened outside of Dr. Leon Tully's clinic. It was like walking into a little slice of the mount that the sons of Azazel carried with them wherever they ventured. A small home away from home. And while it was but a fraction of the size of that incredible sprawling landmass the Watchers had claimed for their own, the Blackthorn camp was impressively large, providing Martha with a new respect for the size of the operation that Stefan was running. Their Watcher fathers had funneled a lot of resources into retaking and holding the area. That it still wasn't quite enough to keep the demons at bay felt like a travesty, and spoke so deeply of why their presence there was long overdue. The monsters had run roughshod through the hills of Blackthorn for far too long, and now the tides were finally turning against their degeneracy. Stefan and the sons of Azazel were doing well, all things considered. Which was why Martha wasn't completely surprised that they were visibly on edge, following what had happened near the border. The bustle of activity that filled the camp was an indicator of a thing she recognised far too well, because she was normally a part of it. They were gearing up for a fight, taking the threat of the demon that she'd encountered seriously. A fact that was confirmed by the stony, disgruntled expression on Stefan's face as he momentarily stopped to check in with some of his brothers, males that Martha recognised because they were members of the unit that tended to go with Stefan wherever he went. The best, most loyal fighters who were not of his blooded kin. Some of the guard that she'd sensed earlier on that day. They didn't acknowledge Martha's presence directly, but they didn't seem surprised to see her standing there either. Over the years, they'd maybe learned to respect the bond that she'd formed with their leader, but they rarely treated her with anything more than indifference. Perhaps because she was female and they thought that might be discourteous to treat her the same way as they would treat their brothers. Or maybe they simply didn't like her. Sometimes it was hard to tell. Stefan swiftly concluded his business and ushered her inside of what was visibly one of the largest huts in the camp, a place where the leader took his rare moments of respite. The corrugated inner walls had been covered over with hardboard for insulation, implying that he was expected to be there for the long haul and had prepared for the colder days that lay ahead. They currently stood bare, unpainted and undecorated. Given what little she'd seen of his suite in their shared residence on the Mount, Martha didn't expect that fact to change. There wasn't much need to display ancient weaponry or heraldry when you needed to keep your blades sharp and no longer carried a shield with you into battle. Those luxuries were a personal touch of home that he didn't seem to miss when out in the field for extended periods of time. The hut was minimally furnished, which was likely more than function than about taste. There were some storage trunks which likely stored Stefan's personal belongings and his gear, and a Nephilim-sized bunk on the far side of the room. The simplistic bedding that covered it The simplistic bedding that covered it, an olive green that was standard issue. There'd be the necessary facilities located in the back of the hut. A sturdy table sat in the middle of the room, which had a simple jury-rigged lamp hanging overhead, and a wooden chair tucked under each side. There'd be a seat for Stefan, one for each of his closest blooded brothers, Isaac and Christoph, and presumably a fourth seat that would normally be set aside for Martha if she were around to potentially share a meal, or any of her downtime here with Stefan's family. As of yet, such an invitation had not been extended. Not at this particular encampment, anyway. But it was nice to see that the potential of her joining them hadn't been completely removed from the equation, that she was welcomed there. Stefan bounded in through the robust steel door behind her, shutting it rather heavily. He was angry. Martha knew this not by his actions alone, but because he was stony-faced, trying to contain the emotion so it didn't make her feel like she had to bear the brunt of it. Which was why she didn't attempt to placate him. He didn't want her to, and it would be disrespectful of her to try. Instead, she tried to steer the impending debriefing in the way that she needed it to go, firmly stating, "You know who that demon is." "Not personally," he grumbled, an edge to his voice as he strode past where she was stood and into the back of the hut, where he retrieved what appeared to be a medical kit. He slammed it down on the surface of the table a mere beat of a second before he placed both of his hands on either side of it, staring at it as if he expected it to open itself up, start tossing out supplies. Even caught amid his bad mood, it didn't obey him. Biting down on her rising anxiety, Martha carefully asserted, "Stefan, I'm no outsider. I've seen this sort of activity before. I know what it means, and it's never a good sign. You're gearing up for this demon." Standing up straight, he rubbed the back of his neck as if he were carrying some extra tension, but he suddenly seemed to agree. "Perhaps we are." She asked him again, "Who is the demon, Stefan?" He dropped his shoulders, finished rolling out his neck, and Martha knew with unwavering certainty that if she went poking around inside of his mind, she'd see the image of a familiar huge demon plaguing his thoughts. He knew more than he was prepared to share, and she was about to get annoyed, but then he beckoned her with an extended hand, noting grimly, "Your palm is still bandaged and you're limping. Let me tend to your wounds as I offered this morning. I'm not happy. Minor injuries like the one you got this morning should have healed by now." She shrugged. "I took extra bumps during the Empire investigation." Stefan tempered his tone. "Come here." Though she wanted to continue to insist that she was fine, Martha knew that she was going to have to pick her battles. It cost her nothing to let Stefan check her over, and he might have had a point about the time that it took for her wounds to heal up. Though it hadn't been a normal day and she'd been under the metaphysical and emotional gun, her hand and ankle should not have still been smarting. And so she crossed the room, pulled out the wooden chair that was nearest to the door. As she lay her bandaged hand down on the table, palm up to expedite matters, she requested, "Will you please answer my questions, Stefan? I need to know who that demon was. I left the clinic and found my friend standing in the street frozen in terror because he'd managed to hide his presence and single her out. I did what I had to do, but I felt outmatched. I felt helpless, and that's not something I ever want to feel." After a moment of careful deliberation, he said, "Let me fix your hand." "It's right there," she pointed out, nodding her head towards it. Unfastening and removing his bulky winter coat and gloves, Stefan carefully laid them down on his bunk before returning to the table. Gazing up at him, as he unbound the handkerchief with a little more care and delicacy than he'd fixed it into place, Martha noticed that underneath his coat he'd been wearing a deceptively thin black jersey that had a high zippered neck and full sleeves designed to further ward off the cold, over what she imagined to be a fitted t-shirt that would be similar to the one she was wearing. Always functional, even if it happened to be a little bit flattering. She flinched, then winced as Stefan pulled the handkerchief off her palm, forcing her to pay attention to what he was doing rather than what he might have been wearing, which was a somewhat worthy distraction. There were two rather nasty-looking slashes down the middle of her palm. It hadn't even begun to heal properly, and judging by the state of it, it wasn't exactly a clean wound either. Martha grimaced, taking the damage in, as did Stefan. In a much calmer tone, he instructed, "Come with me to the sink. Let me clean it up for you." As she nodded, stopped trying to argue that she was fine, especially when he was thoughtful enough to ask, "If you feel like you might be comfortable enough to take off your jacket and roll up your sleeves, then do so. It will make the task easier for me to accomplish." It was a considerate request, but still Martha twisted up her lips, knowing what was coming, and that it was likely going to hurt. While she was not what you might consider squeamish, she was full to the brim with what she'd already been forced to endure for one day. She just wanted it to be over, to go home, to check on Parker, fall into a deep, restful and healing sleep. Pushing back her chair, she found her feet, carefully peeling off her jacket, which Stefan courteously took from her, taking it over to where he'd laid out his own outdoor garments. She watched as he placed it down on the bunk next to his own much larger coat, then followed him through a partition door at the back of the hut to where there was a round metal sink, carefully sliding the long sleeve of her shirt up to her elbow. Holding out his hand, Stefan softly requested, "May I touch you?" Martha nodded, permitted him to gently take the underside of her hand within his. Again he took a moment to re-examine the wound, shook his head, sternly warning, "The water will be quite cold. This will stink." "Okay," she said, consenting one more time, albeit nervously. Stefan turned on the water supply. It flowed from the stainless steel tap with an impressive amount of gusto, pummeling the metal sink with a series of unstoppable punches that were as noisy as they were jarring, implying that the Sons of Azazel had somehow managed to tap into an unknown water source beneath the camp, commandeering it for their personal use. It was freezing as it cascaded over the middle of Martha's torn palm, and she instinctively flinched, tried to pull away, but Stefan's grip on the back of her hand tightened, preventing her cowardice, an act that made a rush of panic flood her chest, the notion of not being able to choose what was happening to her, of being restrained, almost too much for her to handle, a mental battle more than a physical one, but it was real, and she didn't feel strong enough. Knowing this, Stefan muttered an apology. He didn't want to have to be the one holding her steady and inadvertently hurting her, but he couldn't let her continue to carry an injury that wasn't properly tended to. Risk of getting an infection was low, but a mistreated injury could heal poorly, leaving Martha with another scar to go with her many others, and he seemed to want to spare her that outcome, to take care of her to the best of his ability. Eventually satisfied, he immediately shut off the water and let her go, granting her the blessed and swift release to the fear-induced tightness that had formed in her chest. Tiny droplets that trickled off her hand were still tinged pink, the injury lightly welling up with fresh blood. Ruing that she'd been clumsy enough to injure herself in such a pointless way, the young Nephilim kept her forearm hanging over the metallic basin, while Stefan disappeared to retrieve a towel to gently pat it dry. As he did so, he thoughtfully, gently asked her if she was all right. She nodded, not trusting herself to easily speak just yet. Roughly scrubbing his own appendages dry, he hung the towel over the edge of the sink, and then led her back into the main room of the hut. While Martha couldn't attest for certain what his emotional state was, it seemed like the simple act of being able to take care of her was dampening his anger and frustration, the sense of union that she'd always experienced between them re-establishing itself, a blessed change from the awkwardness of the morning when it had felt like they'd struggled. Whatever caused the shift, it seemed to loosen up his lips. As she sat back down in her seat, he informed her. Following your encounter outside the human clinic, we can assume that the headless corpse which was recovered on the summit of Blackthorn Hill was left there by the same demon. He was able to remain undetected as he deposited that abhorrent signal of his intent. It all fits a specific profile. He paused, exhaled a sigh that was edging back towards disgust. To answer your original question, yes, I can identify the demon that you encountered. Tell me, Martha asked, being respectful enough to add, please. I believe that you've come face to face with the demon of wrath. She frowned deeply. Wrath, as in one of the deadly sins. Bringing his attention back to a hand which was again resting on the tabletop, Stefan continued. Like all who inherit such a title, he hails from the court of the Dark King, the same legion as the demon we already hunt in this area. Wrath is one of the most pervasive of sins. His influence is vast, his reputation legendary. He has slain many of our kind. The elucidation made Martha's pulse pick up, the anxiety she was already experiencing finding new and disconcerting paths down which to cruelly travel. Shaking her head back and forth in shock, she murmured, "Oh, I see." Stefan allowed her to sit in silence for a moment, absorb the revelation, allow the idea of who she stepped up to, prepared to fight, to sink in, perhaps fill her with a sense of pride or of dread. Both things felt natural. During her time on the Mount, Martha had been offered a limited yet insightful education into the monsters who'd taken so much more from her than her childhood home. Demons were an inevitable feature of the life of a Nephilim, whether that be through the legendary hunt led by Azazel or via diplomatic relations with humans residing in the mortal realm, the task spearheaded by her father Gadriel, or through additional and vital responsibilities entrusted to the other 5 occupying watchers. Demons were the burden that they had all been born to bear. The vast archives of Penmute, the Watcher of the Word, detailed many terrifying battles the Nephilim warriors had fought against the demons, and Martha had devoured all the information that she could stomach about the monsters that had held her responsible for the horrors that had befallen her, as well as the being who sat at the apex of their kingdom. She understood the intricacies of the legions that exist, but she found that she knew very little about the actual demons, beyond their intimidatingly harsh titles. Wrath was a deadly sin. The demon boasting that name would be the living embodiment of depravity, anger, vengeance, madness, violence. The hulking beast of a demon she encountered personified his sin well. She could see why Stefan had found no difficulty in identifying him. "You said that you didn't know him personally," she observed when she eventually spoke. "Does that mean you've never faced him, Stefan?" "No, I have not," he stated simply, brusquely. Gazing glumly down at her dried, injured hand, he appeared to change the subject, asking her, Would you prefer for me to heal this completely, or simply patch it up for you?" It seemed like a ridiculous question for anybody who asked, for nobody in their right mind would carry an injury for longer than they needed to. Martha understood his desire to seek clarity. Stefan's medical craftsmanship was surprisingly elegant and proficient as his skills in combat, a charming contradiction that she'd always liked. There were few people that she trusted to treat her injuries, and during her initial days on the Mount she hadn't permitted anybody but the favoured son to get close to her. He'd healed her, tended to her diligently and without any hint of a complaint. And then when she'd eventually begun training to become a warrior, there'd been a fair few incidents where she'd needed medical assistance. Days where Stefan had patched up a cut or cleaned out a bothersome scrape that she'd managed to accumulate during sparring. She was well versed in his skills with a medical kit and trusted him implicitly. For greater non-life-threatening injuries that she might have endured in riskier situations out in the field, he was capable of using his Nephilim power to heal her bumps and her bruises, but that cost metaphysical energy. And while she'd been happy to soak up such care when she hadn't known any better, it was an action they now used sparingly. The effect of sharing energy on their bond could be a considerable one, if not done right, and such ties were always tricky to balance. They'd both become very wary of shackling themselves deeply to one another. Bandages and gauzes were utterly harmless. No such risk. "I'm heading home after this," she mused out loud. "It wouldn't be a bad thing to let my body heal naturally, but I'm also really quite exhausted already." Not giving her a modicum of encouragement either way, Stefan reminded her, "As always, this is your decision, Martha." "Okay," she conceded after a moment. "Heal it completely." He nodded, giving her the impression that he felt ordered to do so. Taking her hand once more, he gently pressed his index and middle finger into the palm over the wounds, applying pressure that was firm but gentle, and didn't make her flinch away or experience an irrational fear. She made certain to keep herself emotionally and metaphysically as neutral as possible, so that when he called on his power, a soft celestial glow that she'd last seen the night that he'd drawn her mother out from a demonic nightmare and calmed her down, allowing him to transport her safely to Gadriel. She wasn't exposing herself to any untoward effect upon their bond. Stefan's touch was strangely cool. The act of healing normally performed so fast that it looked like a miracle, but Martha had experienced it enough time to feel the sensation of her skin knitting back together, forming unblemished flesh in its wake. She had no idea how the magic of it worked, but was unable to do such a thing herself, but it never failed to impress her. As Stefan healed her hand, she whispered her gratitude to him, something she knew he would never directly accept. He did, however, softly assure her that it would be as good as new. making her wish that emotional damage was so simple to repair. Being as careful and as tactful as she could be, Martha urged him to talk to me, Stefan. Tell me what you're thinking regarding what's happened. It was in standard protocol for her to verbalise when she could see him struggle. Their bond afforded her many privileges, one of which was a leniency of being less formal in her interactions with him than most in his elite company. But he was still a higher-ranking Nephilim male. It could be considered impolite if she was to straight up ask him how he was feeling. Stefan's reaction was muted at best. He asked, "You cannot tell. You know I'll never read your mind without permission." "I'm thinking that the demon of wrath is a threat that we're ill-prepared for," he told her, giving her the respect she had offered him in return. "One that will require decisive action. I am as of yet uncertain of how his presence will affect our mission here, only that it undoubtedly will." "You think that he'll return?" "I think we need to assume that he's here for a reason. Until we know precisely what that is, we need to be as prepared as we can be." The metaphysical healing complete, Stefan permitted Martha to reclaim her hand. Almost instinctively she found herself supportively clasping it with the other, like she'd been doing all day long, her thumb running back and forth along the line of her palm where the injury had been. Only now it was gone. Strangely, she sort of missed the feeling of the soft fabric that had been used to bind it underneath the pad of her thumb, but it was probably a lot healthier to not have something impulsively taken from Stefan's coat pocket during the spare of the moment holding her broken pieces together. She knew she had to let it go. Easing himself of his burdens, the favoured son continued to talk to her, stating, "The demon of wrath is a monster, in every sense of that word. He has no mercy, no honour. I've never wished to encounter him on the field of battle. He is known by reputation, and it is a litany of brutality and gratuitous violence. He is not a courier sent to dump a body in the hills or to intimidate influential Nephilim. He is a weapon, brandished by his dark king with a specific, usually violent purpose." Martha couldn't help but internalise the vehemence of his words and the antipathy that accompanied it in his eyes. Though she knew that Stefan was no threat to her, she leant back in her seat, feeling vulnerable, weak amidst the impending danger that they faced, and she hated it. Swallowing it down, she stated, "He's come here to kill us." "Perhaps," Stefan agreed pensively. "He must have been watching, following me when I crossed the border and went to the clinic." She shook her head in annoyance. "I never even sensed him." Rather than placate or berate her for a lack of awareness, Stefan's gaze seemed to have fallen on the rest of her body, in a way that was so impersonal it could only ever have been objective. He examined her for further injuries, visually scanning her up and down. She wasn't completely surprised by the next thing that came out of his mouth. "You've been limping." An obvious distraction. But he seemed to be using tending to her as a way of maintaining his own composure, so that they can talk. And she wasn't yet ready to end their conversation. As she wasn't yet ready to end their conversation, it was a small price to pay. Being practical, however, she admitted, "If I take my boot off, I'm afraid I might not be able to get it back on. Whatever damage I did, I think it's swollen up." "I shall put a support strap on it for you, make it easier for you to walk," he offered, giving her the practical option first. "Or, again, I can heal it fully." Shrugging, Martha grumpily conceded, "Okay." Stefan questioned, "Which?" "Heal it properly." The favoured son nodded, happy to comply. Rather than be so arrogant as to expect the Nephilim warrior to bow down before her and unlace her boot, Martha shifted her body forward in her seat, trying not to tense up or visibly flinch at the dull aches in her back, but they made her breath catch in a way that Stefan was sure to notice. Busying herself untying the knot and loosening the laces of her left boot, she steeled herself for him to question it, but he did not, likely storing the fact up in his head to utilise against her later, after he tended to the older injuries that she'd acquired in his presence. It was overwhelming how battered up she'd gotten over the course of one day, not nearly her best innings by a long shot. Knowing better than to feel relieved, Martha pulled the boot off her foot, placing it down next to her on the chair, and removed her sock, sighing to find bruises deepening in a circular patch underneath her inner ankle bone socket and across the top of her foot. The swelling was minor, less than she had been anticipating, but still, she encouraged Stefan to do what he intended to do to heal her, quickly. Pulling out the chair that he'd been standing in front of, he placed it catty-corner to her own. He sat almost as if he was aware how his large frame could be intimidating and wanted to make himself make himself a smaller, if not necessarily less stark, a presence. A sweet concession, one that spoke of his ability to feel the emotions of his female counterpart when they were close to one another, one that spoke of their ongoing bond. Stefan knew Martha's fears and weaknesses as if they were his own, and he seemed to be more than prepared to accommodate her need to stay in control of what was happening to her, as he once again asked for her cooperation and consent by requesting, "Raise and place your foot here upon my knee." Wanting to match his consideration with her bravery, Martha turned in her seat until she was facing him directly and did what he asked. No more, no less. Again he requested, "May I touch you?" Again she responded, "Okay." Stefan worked quickly, wrapping his large hand around her injured ankle, his ungloved palm flush against the top of her foot. Though the summoning of his power was again a cooling touch, the physical contact with the bruising throbbed, making Martha tense up. Again, she knew the favoured son wasn't deliberately trying to cause her any pain, not his intention. Never would that be his intention. But her mind flipped far too easily to the darkest of places, all of her demons clawing their way up out of their graves to remind her that she would never truly be free of them. They could never be killed. Not in her mind, nor in her memories, not in her greatest ever fears. Sensing her distress, Stefan's voice was assuring, but he didn't try to tell her that it was all right. He knew better. Instead, he pragmatically asked her to tell him about what had happened since they separated at the border earlier that morning. There was a visible unhappiness on his face as she described the events that unfolded within Rebecca Patterson's house, what she'd picked up during their short investigation of its rooms and the abrupt confrontation with the spectre of the murdered witch and her wraiths. But he didn't interrupt her, merely listened and let her distract herself with talking. It was a refreshing difference. People tend to debate, discuss and forget the lost art of simply being able to listen before speaking, and while Martha had enjoyed her interaction with Olivia Maxwell at Dr. Tully's clinic, she was glad that Stefan simply sat there and let her proficiently debrief him while he healed her ankle. After she was finished, his stoic face was a mask of restraint. Parker getting hurt affected me a lot more than it should have, she admitted, though Stefan had not prompted such a personal confession. I wasn't in a good frame of mind when we left the house, and I'm afraid that my interaction with the spirit clouded my judgment. I should have been alert crossing the border, but I wasn't. We all paid for my indiscretion. The response was muted, but astute. "Your human means a lot to you." "He does," she said. "But you taught me that the mission should always take priority. It should never be compromised because of my personal feelings. I briefly forgot that today, and left people that I care about vulnerable and exposed. It was Olivia who saw the demon before I did. There was a few minutes before her leaving the clinic and us joining her, and she was so affected by it, frozen with fear. I can't blame her, but she should never have been put through that experience. Nobody ever should." A grunt of what felt like pure frustration left her lips. None of what had transpired that day had been fair, but she could still see the terror etched upon her beautiful pagan friend's face when they found her, standing in the street. It was cruel that she'd been subjected to that demon, and his animosity because she happened to be working with Martha. "The clinic's on this side of the border," she pointed out. "The demon of wrath ambushing me there is not a violation of the pact, but I don't believe that would stop such a monster as prolific as you suggested. What happens if he openly crosses the border into Marytown to try and come after me again?" Stefan tactfully replied, "I have sent word to my father." Has Azazel responded? "Not yet. If it comes to pass that this demon does violate the pact, I want to know that everything that can be done to seek condemnation for it is being done. It's one thing for me to be operating inside of Marytown. It's quite another for the Dark King to send his most dangerous demon here." The hard edge in Stefan's diamond-esque eyes implied that he agreed. Martha continued, If there's any chance that the pact will be revoked, I need to know about it as soon as possible. A treaty might not always be worth the words that are printed on it, but it keeps the people of Marytown safe, and I'll do everything in my power to ensure that it stays that way. It did not stop a demon throwing your stepfather from a window, the favoured son bitterly reminded her. Nor did it prevent that evil excuse of a king sending demons to town 13 years ago, with the intent of causing irrevocable damage to Gadriel through the abduction of his mortal kin. The pact didn't protect you, a person of Marytown, from being hurt, Martha. I have little faith in its ability to ensure a thing that it has never done. Which felt about as brutal in its receipt as in how it was delivered. Sealing her eyes, Martha drew her blessedly healed foot off Stefan's knee and retreated to her chair, her safe little corner of their world. Yes, she was well aware of the flaws that her long-time mentor excessively described, recalling vividly the times that the pact had failed to protect either her or a person within her familiar circle. She carried the scars on her body as graphically as she did within her mind and in her soul, impossible for her to ever forget. Fighting not to rise to what felt like a personal affront, she tried to steer the conversation away from the awful parts of her past, ceding to what she knew was the intent behind Stefan's outburst. She was unnerved by what had happened, by her encounter with the demon of wrath. He feared, not only for her safety, but what it meant for their mission, for himself and for all of his brothers stationed on this side of the border where the beast had been seen. He attempted to temper his distress and displeasure by attempted to temper his distress and displeasure by tending to her physical injuries, but making sure that she could walk without limping did not fix this problem any more than relying upon the pact to do its duty. It was natural to be afraid, given the situation that lay before them. They had taken vows, dedicated their lives to the cause that their respective fathers heralded, a dangerous cause, which only tended to end one way. Few Nephilim ever died of old age. Likely neither would they. One day a demon would come along that they wouldn't be able to defeat. The demon of wrath could very well be the demon who advanced the end of their hunt. Martha understood this. She couldn't even begin to imagine the additional pressure that it placed on Stefan's shoulders, even as she worried about the safety of the people that she cared about on the Marytown side of the border. She was also aware that it was her actions that had led to this situation, and she felt the weight of the responsibility. She just wanted them all to survive, even if the odds seemed to be stacking up against them. Stefan asked her, "Do you recall the promise that I made to you the very first day you woke up in our shared residence on the Mount?" Of course, Martha remembered. It might not have been the first time that she'd ever encountered Stefan North, but the first time that they'd been able to interact in a way that had nothing to do with violence or fear or survival. The moment she'd finally stopped being afraid and accepted that she was safe. Yes, she nodded, swallowing down her rising emotions. You swore to me that you'd never let another demon hurt me as badly as I'd been hurt. You vowed that you'd always protect me, no matter the cost. Do you still believe those words? Believe my words to you? Discovering the same unwavering determination in his diamond eyes that he had offered her back then, she wanted to, but things had changed. She could no longer avoid the same risk that she'd been able to when she'd been under the watchful proximity of his presence, and she couldn't avoid fighting the monsters when her mission was to root them out of their lavish hovels and stop their influence spreading any further than it already had. She couldn't back down from a challenge when it was standing directly across the street, looking like it would enjoy nothing more than tearing her to pieces, and Stefan could no longer shadow her, ensure that she was keeping herself safe from any potential harm. In a tone that denoted he was pulling rank and would not let her argue with him, Stefan informed her. As well as strengthening the border with my most perceptive scouts, I intend to assign added protection where it's best required. There was a briefest moment of hesitation before he noticed. I'd rather you remained here at camp until this matter's resolved, but I imagine that you intend to head straight back into Marytown tonight. It wasn't a question, but Martha still responded. I have to. Then I shall accompany you, see you back safely. While she understood his reasoning, it didn't seem like the best use of his resources, taking him away from his brothers when he might be needed with them at the border or out in the hills or wherever he was most needed to prepare for the worst. Remaining by her side, entering Marytown whether or not he was currently feeling resentful about the disadvantages of the pact, seemed like a foolish risk, like he was putting her ahead of his mission, and she simply couldn't let him do that. Shaking her head, Martha said, "That isn't practical. I'll do what is necessary to ensure the ongoing success of the mission that our fathers entrusted to us, and that now means keeping you alive and safe." Martha wished that his lofty assertions were true, but they simply weren't. As unique a position as she was in, given her heritage and ties to the area, she was not yet so arrogant to think of herself as all important to the liberation of her hometown. She wanted to be a part of this, absolutely. But the sons of Azazel, led by a warrior like Stefan, could easily take Marytown back from those who corrupted it. Without her, she might have been the only female in their impressive ranks, but she wasn't especial. Not even that adept of a fighter. Any of them could succeed where she clumsily fumbled, and Stefan knew it. He must have known it. The nature of their dynamic had changed a lot since the day that he'd made that special vow to her. But when it came to his sense of honour and duty, Stefan North was the same male that he'd always been. Hoping to perhaps appeal to this side of him while placating his overprotective nature for the moment, Martha tempered her impulsive desire to argue with him, and instead offered a compromise, saying, "There's something that I would like to do across the border before I go home this evening. If you'd like to accompany me while I do it, I would appreciate the help." With a definite relief, he told her, "I would like that. The man that runs Empire, Peter Maxwell, is one of Gadriel's most loyal supporters. His team mean a lot to me." Of course, Stefan knew this fact, but she made another request. Do you think that you'd be able to spare some of your brothers to watch over them, just to be on the cautious side? I hate the thought that Olivia Maxwell was put in the potential firing line of that demon. I want to make sure that they're all safe from his reach." Without hesitation, he swore, "It shall be done. Thank you, Stefan." Seemingly conflicted, the favoured son of Azazel rose back up to his feet and offered Martha his ungloved hand, willing to assist her up out of her seat, as if he might permit her to pretend that there wasn't still parts of her body that were injured. Stealing her resolve, she accepted the offer, linking her now uninjured hand with his and levering herself up onto her own feet, pleased to have two perfectly functioning ankles. The muscles in her lower back vehemently protested the movement, having stiffened up while she'd been sitting. She tried to put a brave mask over her pain. When Stefan stepped in that little bit closer to her, into her personal space, Martha found herself staring up at him, much like she had on the hillside when she'd been foolish enough to stumble and he'd been agile enough to catch her in his arms. For a while she felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the hours since that moment, but also relieved that she could easily find herself back under the weight of his protective gaze, knowing that for now she was safe and well. She'd survived another day in this world and hadn't lost everything that she held dear. The favoured son of Azazel would never compromise with the life of the young female Nephilim that he'd taken under his wing. Even if they were ultimately destined to be parted by fate or the whims of their angelic fathers deciding to intervene and making it less possible for her to be by his side, she knew they would always manage to find their ways back to each other. It shouldn't have momentarily dumbfounded her when he asked her, for the third time, "May I touch you, Martha?" But she blinked up at him several times before asking, "Why?" "Your back," he explained. "I'd like to ease the pain within it." Ridding herself of any foolish possibilities that he might have had other intentions, she responded for the third time, "Okay." As he reached his arms around her waist, she instinctively raised her own like a barrier between their bodies, though there was never any real need to enforce such an overt distance. Stefan knew her boundaries well and would never encroach further than she'd permitted him to venture. Still, as his hands fell upon her lower back and he asked whether he could place them beneath the material of her hooded shirt and onto her skin, Martha had to again fight far too many of her own inner demons. A transitory moment of panic flooded her chest, but she battled through it enough to nod and allow him to continue. She had nothing to fear. Stefan knew precisely what his hands would find as he deftly raised the back of her hooded shirt, enough for them to make contact with her bruised and beaten up flesh. He'd seen the vicious wounds that marred her back long ago. He had treated, bathed and bandaged them. He'd helped her recover in the aftermath of their evil infliction. He knew how badly she'd been scarred. He was never going to pull away from her in revulsion or in shock. His intentions in making contact with them were far from the evil desires of those who had created them, the polar opposite. He just wanted to heal her, to ease the discomfort that she was in, not tear deeply into her flesh with the explicit intentions of making her scream. The fresh injuries that Martha carried on her back were utterly minor in comparison to her old scars. Bumps and bruises from when she'd hit the wall of Rebecca Patterson's bedroom and collided with the well-stocked vanity table before tumbling to the floor. It took minimal effort for Stefan to call upon his celestial power to ease their aches, reduce the swelling, and make it better, though her back would never truly be as good as new. Your scars are a testimony to all that you've endured and all that you're capable of surviving, he assured her, all over again. They have made you who you are, and I've never been more proud of you. You're a survivor. And yet I still endure, she repeated what felt like a very old motto. Removing his hands from her back, Stefan righted her clothing and repeated his very old promise to her again. Never again. Martha bowed her head, in part acknowledgement of what he freely offered, but also because she felt emotionally conflicted. Seeing Stefan struggle between his personal desire to protect her, that very old promise, and his determination to do his duty was more difficult than she would have ever imagined. He was usually the strong one, the stoic one. On the day that it had been decided that she would stay in Marytown, she'd forced herself to stand up and walk away, to be brave while he'd been so very strong. It had always been that way between them, for as long as she'd known. Stefan had always protected her, and while she wasn't sure whether she should still desire it, Martha liked the idea of hiding in the safe shadow of his imposing stature, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that if the demon of wrath attempted to come looking for her again, he would find himself having to go through this male, and nothing ever tended to survive such a brazen attempt. Stefan would do everything in his power and ability to honour the vow that he'd made to her. Martha didn't know if that would keep her safe from all of the enemies that she seemed to be accumulating, but she knew with no ounce of doubt that her otherworldly companion wouldn't let them take her alive. Never again. He knew her deepest fears, knew that she would rather die than have to ever endure that, and he would never again let it come to pass. He had worked so tirelessly to right the wrongs that had been committed against her, and now she had to return to Marytown so that she could right a wrong that she might have committed herself, one that still played upon her mind even though she'd seemingly had bigger and more potentially deadly problems out there. The innocent lives that had been affected by the darkness which had long corrupted the lands around her mortal home needed somebody who could be for them what Stefan North had been for her, an eternal and steadfast hero. Even if they'd done awful things that felt far too personal, it should never have mattered. Martha had started something within Marytown that she couldn't run away from and run away and turn her back on. Whatever danger she was in, whatever demon tried to intimidate her with their physical threat. For the people that she loved to be safe, Marytown needed to be liberated, and she could not stop now. The monsters could not be permitted to reclaim her town, her home, to scare her away and take it hostage once more. To protect it, Martha had to follow the example that Stefan had set for her. She had to be willing to lose, willing to sacrifice it all for what mattered the most to her. And while she might not have gotten down on her knee on the border of the town, pledged herself and her honour to protect it for as long as she still had breath in her body, she would fight for its liberation, against all who stood against her. Never again would it fall. Maybe while she was at it, she could embrace the side of her nature that wasn't so human, that was tied eternally to the living example that she admired, the side that she hadn't been able to walk away from, even when duty had demanded that she ought. Okay, so that was chapter 12. Martha debriefing Stefan on what had happened and finally getting some of her injuries tended to. She's been a bit beaten up that day. It was a bit of a tough day at the office for her. And yeah, so it appears that the Nephilim are taking the threat of the demon that she encountered very seriously. And yeah, Stefan seems to be struggling between his sense of duty and his sense of keeping her safe. But we'll see what happens with all of that. There is things to do. She wants to head back into Marytown and take care of something, and yeah, we will see where that goes. I don't really have anything much to say today. Thank you as always for watching. Thank you for joining me once again, and I will be back with more Art of War, Hell Hath No Fury very soon. So take care of yourselves.